So in this video, we're going to talk some more about community ecology, starting with coevolution in communities. This can include predator-prey relationships, where the predator and prey evolve defenses and adaptations to those defenses. Parasite-host relationships, very similar. And flower and pollinator relationships, where the flower is adapted to the kind of pollinator that pollinates that particular plant. These are long-term evolutionary adjustments between species. So how do we characterize a community? We talk about the structure of the community. We talk about its diversity, how many different kinds of species live there. Its composition. What is the dominant species? What's the most abundant species or the highest biomass species, total weight? Any keystone species that might be there. And the composition changes over time through succession. So species diversity, greater diversity equals greater stability, healthier environment. Greater biodiversity, more food resources for the species that live there, more habitats for places for species to live, more resilience in the face of environmental change. If something happens, more of the community will survive. Reducing biodiversity, agriculture, growing one kind of plant is an example of monoculture, whereas old field, you've got lots of diversity there. One of the problems with reduced biodiversity happened in Ireland with the Irish potato famine. 1970 U.S. corn crop failure are two examples where reduced biodiversity, big impact. So what are keystone species? So these are species that have a bigger impact on the community than you might expect otherwise. They have a very influential ecological role. They exert important regulatory effects on the other species in the community. Keystone species increase the diversity in the habitat. The graph here shows the mussels and other things with and without this one particular, with the sea star. Sea otters are a keystone species in the North Pacific. They affect, lots of things. Orcas, another keystone species. When there's too many sea otters, it reduces diversity. So you can see the kelp diversity increases when there's lots of beavers are another keystone species in the northeast and the west. They build the dams and they create ponds, creating new habitats along the river. And that brings us to ecological succession. Community changes over time in an area. There's a transition in species composition over time. This is years or even decades in the process. Most often today, ecological succession happens after there's been some kind of disturbance in the environment, like a volcanic eruption spewing lots of ash and kind of creating a new environment. So primary succession begins with virtually lifeless area without soil. So like a new island forms, a glacier retreats, and you basically got bare rock. So you've got kind of the pioneer species, bacteria, lichens, mosses that come in. They're very hardy. They break some of the rock down and start making soil, which allows for grasses, which then changes the environment to where maybe shrubs and even trees might be able to grow depending on what biome you're in. Secondary succession happens when an existing community is cleared, but the base soil is still intact, like a forest fire comes through. And there are some communities that rely on fire to keep them healthy. Burning releases nutrients that were locked up in the trees and can kind of start the process over again. You can see different stages of succession in these pictures here. The pioneer species of the lichens and mosses. Grasses do well in high sunlight areas. Brushes and small trees can move in as the soil gets thicker and richer. More shade-tolerant species show up, and then you get the trees, if we're talking about a forest biome, are more shade-tolerant species. Stable community, sometimes we call this the climax community. In this case, it would be a climax forest. Now, the climax community isn't always trees. It could be grasslands. It could be lots of things depending on which biome you're in. So why does succession happen? Well, there's two factors. There's tolerance. Early species are weedy, selected species, so they can grow rapidly. They can tolerate harsh conditions. They don't need really good soil. Lots of sunlight, all that stuff are okay. But as they die and decompose, they change the composition of the soil and they change the conditions there. And they actually make it so other types of communities are going to be more successful. So early species facilitate habitat change, changes in soil pH, changes in soil fertility, changes in light levels, and they allow other species to then outcompete them. A climax community or climax forest is a plant community dominated by trees that represents the final stage of natural succession for a specific location. What kind of forest? Is it actually a forest? It's going to depend on which biome you're in. You get a stable community, remains unchanged in species composition for long times as long as the site is undisturbed. There are different kinds of climax forests. Depends on the abiotic factors in the region, solar energy levels, temperature, the amount of rainfall, fertility and depth of the soil, all of those things. So it could be a taiga forest, it could be a temperate deciduous forest, it could be an evergreen forest, lots of them. So sometimes disturbances are part of the natural cycle for an area. In fact, sometimes they're needed for survival. Some trees, for instance, and some forests rely on periodic fires that don't completely destroy the trees, but oftentimes will burn off the underbrush to allow biodiversity to return. Kind of rejuvenates the habitat. Forest climax, fire climax forests are an example of this. Jack pines, their cones open up from the heat of the fire and release the seeds. So they've adapted to survive and reproduce in areas that have frequent fires. One of the problems we're having today is people are building their homes and communities in these fire climax zones. And if we suppress the fires, we get too much fuel built up and we get a really, really bad fire.